Chinese electric vehicles are Trojan horses collecting data at the behest of Beijing. So the U.S. government seems to think. Last week, the White House announced an investigation into whether Chinese EVs pose national security risks. President Biden likened these EVs as smartphones on wheels, which could collect sensitive data in the U.S. and could even be remotely controlled by Beijing. Now, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on Chinese-made cars, a policy that President Biden kept in place. In 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was introduced, which subsidizes new energy vehicles, bar those with Chinese-made batteries. Is the U.S. taking what China sees as trade protectionist measures to a whole new level? Do Chinese EVs really pose a national security threat to the U.S.? As China becomes a leading EV manufacturer and exporter, can such measures step on the gas for American car makers? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Gong, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics, Israel. From Brisbane, Australia, by Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology and a Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute, a think tank. And from Shanghai, by Josef Mahoney, Professor at East China Normal University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So let's take a closer look at what's been announced. The White House statement released on February the 29th says connected vehicles collect large amounts of sensitive data on their drivers and passengers, regularly use their cameras and sensors to record detailed information on U.S. infrastructure, interact directly with critical infrastructure, and can be piloted or disabled remotely. Therefore, President Biden is announcing unprecedented actions to ensure that cars on U.S. roads from countries of concern like China do not undermine U.S. national security. Professor Gong, a lot of information to unpack there. What is your biggest, what caught your eye in that announcement I just quoted?
Well, first of all, I agree that electric vehicles do collect a lot of data. But whether the data is concerning a national infrastructure as perceived as posing a threat to or risk to a national security, that's an entirely different set of questions, and I think it's all debatable. But another thing that bothers me is that, as far as I know, there's not a single electric car being made in China currently sold in the United States, if I'm correct. There are some buses I know made by BYD actually being sold in the United States. But why does the White House issue something like this just bothers me? On the other hand, we know for a fact that there are millions and millions of American-made electric cars under the brand name Tesla, as well, know it, being sold in China. They're sold like hotcakes, and they're very popular. I don't think Chinese government has taken any action of the similar vein like the White House has done, and it's all okay. I mean, I think Tesla's doing great business here in China. In addition, China also exports a lot of electric cars to the European Union market as well. We haven't seen any European market taking such an action from a national security perspective. I think the idea that cars that bring so much convenience and amenities to people these days can pose a national security threat, that's something that's mind-boggling to me.
Professor Powell, what is your biggest takeaway from this paragraph? And we're also hearing this countries of concern like China. What exactly does that mean? And what is the criteria for deciding which country is of concern to the United States, which country is not?
Well, I don't know which country is of concern, other than that is a nice catch-all category, I guess, that enables administrations to do whatever they wish to do. The passage that you read out highlights two things to me. The first one is that the United States already has 135 Apple smartphones operating across the country, most of which, I think, or all of which are made in China at the moment. So the idea that a connected vehicle is a cell phone or a mobile phone on wheels implies, I guess, that there are concerns around the capability of smartphones, which of course there hasn't been. And the reason, and this is the second point, is that nation states have the technical and regulatory wherewithal to actually govern not only where and how data is collected, but importantly, how it's transmitted and stored. Now, if you can't have confidence in your information technology, technical capability, and regulatory enforcement apparatuses to manage that, then I think you've got some serious challenges. And the fact is that a report has come out recently which actually shows that the biggest number of data breaches globally has actually been in the United States, where data breaches have grown 300% in the last 12 months. So I think there are concerns around data security in the United States, and frankly, this issue about them being related to connected cars, so to speak, is a little bit excessive.
Professor Mahoney, I want to get your take on this, but let's also listen to Gina Raimondo, who is U.S. Secretary of Commerce. She said this on March the 1st on MSNBC. Let's take a look at her explanation about this.
You know, it's like an iPhone on wheels. Imagine a world where there's 3 million Chinese vehicles on the road in America, and Beijing could turn them all off at the same time.
So, Professor Mahoney, what is your take? Is she really talking about something as a real case scenario, or is really bluffing and scaring the hell out of the American people?
Well, as John noted, there are almost no Chinese EVs in the U.S. This is because of the tariffs that were started during the Trump administration. And I think they've actually increased to 37% since Biden has been in office. But nevertheless, most security experts agree that the real risk of espionage or even sabotage, even if there were some critical mass of Chinese EVs in the American market, would be relatively small and could be mitigated with easy rules like those followed by Tesla in China. Now, we've seen this type of scaremongering with other Chinese technology products, including Huawei and TikTok, where the imagined ghost in the machine is always China. And I think we should recall that Raimondo actually called again China in that same press conference, I believe, America's foreign adversary. But, you know, the real concerns here relate to U.S. protectionism, economic warfare, global strategy, and domestic politics in the midst of a presidential campaign, especially in battleground states like Michigan, where the U.S. Traditional automobile industry enjoys its historical base.
Well, Raimondo denied that these are for winning votes, and she also denied these are protective measures. Professor Gong, what are really the consideration behind these measures? We have seen a slew of actions against Chinese brands such as Huawei, such as TikTok, and now EVs, although EVs are nowhere prevalent in U.S. markets. Do you see a pattern, a continuity of attitude or policy against these brands?
My guess is that it could be a combination of reasons. I think certainly, from a national security perspective, at this point where there's practically no Chinese-made electric cars being sold in the United States, raising an issue like this at this point, does contribute to the speculation that it's very much election campaign motivated. And after all, as Joe has just said, Michigan is a very critical state right now, and he's in big trouble. I mean, there are 300,000 people living in Michigan of the Arab heritage or Muslim heritage or from Middle East heritage, and they're very, very angry. I mean, look at the primary in the state of Michigan, Democratic primary in Michigan. I mean, that's 100,000 uncommitted votes right now. I mean, accounting for almost 30% of total votes cast in the state of Michigan Democrat primary, and that's a huge warning signal to him. So I think there's absolutely reason to speculate that this is indeed an election motivated issue. After all, Michigan, as Josef said, is an auto state. A lot of auto workers. Remember, I think in 2022 when there was a automobile industry strike going on, and I think he went to Detroit and picketed with the auto workers. I think he has to win Michigan, period. If he loses Michigan, he's going to be kicked out of the White House.
Professor Powell, do you agree that this is campaign politics that's, campaigning that's at play here? And he was talking about unprecedented action. What kind of unprecedented action could there be if such an investigation does conclude that there is national security threat coming from these EVs from China?
Look, I think it is 100% driven by domestic political considerations, and it has been the case now for the best part of the last 5 or 6 years at least. Since about 2017, 2018, there has been a distinct change in the tenor of American public policy towards China in economic terms, driven in large part, I think, by an acceptance at that moment in time that the 30 or 40 years of effort prior to that to mould and shape China, as Jake Sullivan recently said, did not bear fruit. And from that time onwards, China has been seen in various terms as an adversary. In terms of so-called unprecedented actions, in effect, the American policy arrangement, if you will, has a number of choices before it. It could just simply ban certain vehicles, or it could increase tariffs further. That's one option. The other option is to invest more significantly themselves to actually do something about their undercapacity, either from a private sector point of view, bearing in mind that the traditional autos, or the legacy manufacturers, if you will, have been slow on the uptake in terms of this particular segment. Or, of course, government could get more involved from a funding point of view, which I doubt would happen. And lastly, of course, there is the Hungary option, and that is for the US to open their arms to Chinese capital, Chinese know-how in this EV space, and secure domestic manufacturing capabilities in partnership with Chinese firms. I suspect they won't do that.
China's foreign ministry commented on the U.S. announced investigation on February 29th, and here is a soundbite from the spokesperson of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let's listen in.
是明显针对特定国家的歧视性做法。
These are discriminatory practices clearly targeted at certain countries. China firmly rejects these measures. The Chinese government takes data privacy and security very seriously. We have never asked and will never ask any company or individual to collect or provide data, information, or intelligence located abroad against local laws for the Chinese government. We put forward the Global Initiative on Data Security. If the U.S. truly cares about data security, it can publicly endorse this initiative or make similar commitments.
So here we have a similar issue. It's like deja vu. We've heard this concerning Huawei. We've heard this concerning TikTok. The U.S. decides that is a national security matter, and China says these are trade protectionist measures. Of course, according to the World Trade Organization, which is supposed to be arbiter of whether a trade practice is protectionist or not, there are different definitions. But here, the U.S. says we are for national security, and there's a sense of we are not going to go all transparent about it. We can impose certain issues so long as we have legitimate concerns, whereas China says you need to have evidence. Professor Mahoney, are we again seeing the same kind of scenario playing out between the two countries? How can this be resolved?
Well, I think that the key point here is that there is, from Trump to Biden, we see a lot of continuities in terms of an emerging grand strategy with aiming to sustain U.S. hegemony and imperialism globally, perhaps even moving back to some sort of Cold War paradigm. Now, we can talk about why the U.S., for example, has resisted China's call for the Global Initiative on Data Security. In part, we know this is because the U.S. employs double standards. This is, in fact, one of the key characteristics of a hegemon, of an imperial country, is to employ double standards, to hold people to a standard that doesn't apply to themselves. That's what makes imperialism and hegemony possible. So, it's all the more ironic that the U.S. is constantly concerned about Chinese technology when we know for a fact that the CIA has actually created technology companies and sold products to allies in order to spy on them. The U.S. spies on everyone, and everyone knows this, and even spies on members of the Five Eyes, these nations that in turn help the U.S. spy on other countries, including China. So again, this is a double standard, but it's an understandable one in so much as it is natural in a competitive nation-state system for one country to spy on the other and to try to restrict the extent to which it can be spied upon. But again, this issue really isn't about spying. It's about economic protectionism and about domestic politics. And one thing to add to something about domestic politics that we neglected before, which is it's true that both the Republicans and the Democrats are promoting bipartisan efforts against China, including on EVs. But the reason why the Republicans are doing it is because they're anti-EVs altogether. They think that climate change is a Chinese plot that's trying to drive American automakers and the oil industry out of business. So this is where there's some fractures in the American approach.
Yeah. Well, if we're living in this current system, which we cannot change overnight, how do we deal with it? I guess that is the bigger question, and how do we understand it? I mean, for instance, in terms of China and the United States, this is not the first time such a dispute has happened. Is there a feasible way for the two countries to resolve such issues, or the U.S. is going to continue to deploy the excuse of national security and suppress Chinese businesses? At least that's the impression from China. Professor Gong.
Yeah, well, I totally agree, actually, that there got to be some regulation about, data usage in the automobile industry. I think, for all practical purposes, these cars are indeed collecting a lot of data, and, if you think about from a national security perspective, how do you handle that data from the perspective of protection of privacy, also protection of national security. That's all understandable. But I think the issue is that, how to do these things and what type of regulations, these are the things can be discussed by the two governments, and there got to be some dialogue between the two sides. After all, both two countries are one of the largest manufacturers of automobiles. I mean, they are the leaders in the automobile industry, the global automobile industry. So as the cars are becoming more and more connected, more and more using cellular technologies to be connected, I think there is a legitimate reason that some kind of a regulation, or what type of regulation, discussion about these regulations should be happening at the national level between the two sides. And I think maybe even involving Germany, Japan, there got to be some discussions like this. That I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, are there this kind of discussion happening under the current geopolitical situation, Professor Powell? Because China, as we mentioned just now, China did put forward this global initiative on data security in September 2020, calling, among other things, that states should respect sovereignty, jurisdiction, and governance of data of other states, and shall not obtain data located in other states through companies or individuals without other states' permission. Of course, the U.S. and other major Western countries have no reaction to this initiative. Is there any hope, any leeway at all that some kind of negotiation or coordination can take place on an international level, so you have at least some kind of rules, not just anybody taking unilateral action and say, I suspect you and I'm going to take action against you regardless of how you feel about it?
I suspect that over the next few years, there will be forces that will in effect drive nations to adopting rules that are actually quite similar, if not identical to each other in relation to data sovereignty. Now, the US has actually resisted this for a long time, in large part because historically it's American big tech straddling the world that has been able to hoover up data of citizens and businesses from other countries and passing that on both to the American state and security apparatuses, as well as selling that data on the open market. So until now, it actually hasn't been of particular concern to the administration. That said, given this particular issue that is emerging around EVs in this case, it is putting data sovereignty onto the agenda. And it's an issue that China's actually played a very leading role in. And interestingly, the European Union has also been highly sensitive to data security of its citizens, in large part because over the last 5 years or so, it's actually American big tech that has been most at fault in terms of stealing the data of EU citizens. So I think that whether or not there is explicit dialogue around these issues, the objective forces and conditions are going to drive nations towards something that looks quite similar.
Yeah. Professor Mahoney, do you think China will be able to do something, the Chinese government will be able to do something if unprecedented actions are taking place against the Chinese EVs, if the investigation turns out to be unfavorable against China?
Well, I think, firstly, let me say I agree with Warwick. I do think that we are moving in the trend of some sort of global agreement. We have to, because I don't think ultimately that this Cold War or division is going to work out. And I think that we've seen some reception, some positive reception in Europe for this type of initiative. If we look at the investigation from a positive point of view, Biden could have put in place already some poison pills. In fact, a number of poison pills are already in effect that have completely limited Chinese entrance. But nevertheless, there's some idea that perhaps an investigation versus simply killing China's access at this time is meant to delay, on the one hand, appeal to domestic voters in a highly polarized election, but also to delay decisions, because Biden does want a green transition, at least rhetorically. Right. And the only way you can achieve that green transition is with not only Chinese EVs, but parts and batteries being made by Chinese companies, which many of his adversaries and green transition adversaries are also targeting. So it may be that this is a delaying tactic. It may be that Biden hopes that if he's reelected, that this can be revisited in a less politicized way.
Is it going to be effective, though? Exactly as you said, China is powering full ahead. Chinese President Xi Jinping just said very recently that it is essential to choose the right path for technological innovation, leverage the strength of the new system for mobilizing resources nationwide in a joint effort to achieve breakthroughs in core technologies in green energy field. So China, on the one hand, is going all out, right, to become even more competitive in terms of new energy vehicles and related industry, whereas at this moment, US's big legacy automakers, Ford, General Motors, for instance, are experiencing heavy losses in EV division. The two countries are cutting costs in the sector and stepping up efforts to make more EVs. Professor Gong, is the kind of unprecedented action envisioned going to work to narrow the gap between the two sides?
Well, I think the Biden administration is taking a setback because of the EV cars, or actually in these days in the United States, not so many cars being sold, or pickup trucks or SUVs. They're not selling so well these days, unfortunately. But here in China, we know there's a boom for that kind of vehicles as well. Same things happen in Europe. I think the reason that the EV industry is so successful in China is purely because of market competition, in my view. If you look at the number of cars, brands on the Chinese market, I mean, there are almost like, 3-digit number, and almost 100 brands so far. I mean, this is kind of a intense market competition is not observed in other markets at all. And not just the traditional ICE manufacturers, internal combustion car manufacturers that are transitioning towards the electric era. I mean, there are also other new forces, from internet space, about 10 or 20 of these companies. And it's not just selling here in China, expanding overseas as well. They're selling very well in the European market as well. And I think, the government's policy towards a new energy era, the competition here in China, and after all, I think at the end of the day, the very well-run Chinese companies, efficient Chinese companies, they are all accounting for the success here. So I think, the technology gap as it's happening right now in the United States, it's only going to widen, unfortunately.
So, well, some people would argue, sorry for interrupting, some people would argue then even Tesla's Elon Musk said some kind of trade barrier would be necessary because Chinese EV manufacturers just extremely good, extremely competitive. So coming from the devil's advocate's perspective, Professor Powell, I mean, other countries, other manufacturers are often left without a choice basically we're seeing a reverse of what was happening at the beginning of China's reform and opening up, right? Foreign competitors so powerful and Chinese companies at a very much disadvantaged situation. How do you look at that?
Look, I think that broadly speaking, globally, there is a powerful set of trends towards moving away from internal combustion engines. And that trend is going to continue well into the future, in part because the competitiveness of these new energy vehicles is now at such a point that they are actually more cost effective than the old ICE vehicles. This will matter in the developing world in particular, which doesn't have incumbent manufacturing capacity. So as the developing world, the global south, if you will, continues to develop, the ability for markets in those areas to access low-cost, high-performance, clean modes of transportation will just drive this technology and this industry in any regard. The European body politic is a little bit different to the American one in that there is much less of influence from the old oil industry, if you will. Interestingly, the European situation looks like one where as we know, BYD is setting up a factory in Hungary. And last week, or earlier this week, the Italian government has actually reached out to BYD to open discussions about BYD setting up a manufacturing facility in Italy, because the incumbent manufacturer has already made noises in Italy that they intend on closing down and moving out. So there are many dynamics at work. Traditional markets where the politics drives, the incumbent position of the ICE manufacturers. Yeah, look, that may retard the market, but it's a big world out there now, and it's a world that is crying out for the clean, green solutions.
Yeah. Finally, Professor Mahoney, not too much time left. I have the impression that the United States may well put a wall to protect its legacy, its traditional auto manufacturing sector. But as Powell said, as Professor Powell pointed out, in the wild, wild world, the trend is going to continue. People's needs for cheap, affordable, and good cars, clean cars, will increase, and there's a huge market out there. So if American companies cannot become more competitive on their own terms, they're going to lose out this huge market internationally. Your take?
Well, in fact, they've already lost out, and we should keep in mind that it was those legacy automakers that for decades suppressed the development of the green EV industry in the United States, and now they're reaping the sad crops of those efforts. I think the one key thing here that will be clear, certainly I peer-reviewed a paper for a leading journal that looked at this recently, that what China did was make the EV market in China very open to international competition. That's why we saw Tesla coming in and building a gigafactory in Shanghai. And this is what forced Chinese
to wake everybody up,
to really get into the game. And China also supported core investments in core science related to battery development, and this was another thing where China has moved ahead. So it's really head-to-head competition and open and free market competition. This is a test case, and it's sort of ironic that this is one of the reasons why the U.S. is saying that China should be restricted, because they're not playing by the rules.
Well, the White House says China imposes restrictions on American autos and other autos operating in China, whereas beginning in 2022, China allowed full foreign ownership of passenger car manufacturing on the mainland. So I don't know where they got their information. Anyway, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Gong, Warwick Powell, and Josef Mahoney for joining me from different parts of the world. And many thanks to our audience for having followed this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point.